Well, good evening and greetings. I'm Fran Matera, and welcome to the St. Patrick's Day edition of Must See Monday. Also, welcome back from spring break, and certainly it's a pleasure, and we're indeed fortunate to welcome Edelman President and CEO Mark Hass, as well as his U.S. leadership team who are meeting on campus this week. Their visit offers two opportunities for students to learn about the professional sphere tonight and Must See Monday, and tomorrow at a panel at the same location where the Director of Recruiting will be discussing life at Edelman. And of course, Edelman is the world's largest PR firm, so of course PR students will be interested in the conversation tomorrow night. Tomorrow evening also, it is followed by a networking reception in the Clifford Gallery. So we certainly encourage and expect our students to participate, and we appreciate your attention to these carefully crafted events in your behalf. Tonight's guest is uniquely qualified to talk about the robust intersection, or maybe it's more like a mashup, of journalism and PR and online media. Why? Because he's lived it, if not created it. Mark, earlier in his career, worked as a reporter and editor at the Miami Herald, the Syracuse Post-Standard, and as assistant managing editor at the Detroit News. His staff won the Pulitzer Prize. And in '93, he was part of the team that created one of the nation's first comprehensive newspaper websites. In '99, he pioneered the integration of online strategies into communication activities for global companies. So it can be said that he certainly knows his way around the digital landscape. And he can also navigate cultural divides, as demonstrated by his leadership of Edelman's business efforts in China, and prior to that, his service as CEO in numerous global PR firms. And as you might expect, he also counsels Fortune 500 companies on a range of business and communication needs. But he also cares about education, one of the reasons why he is here. Why? He is a board member of the U.S. Accrediting Council on Education in Journalism and Mass Communications. He's a trustee of the Institute for Public Relations, a member of the Arthur Page Society, and on the boards of several advisory roles in several nonprofit organizations. And most importantly, for certainly students, he offers hope to those who graduate with a degree in English. Mark graduated magna cum laude from Buffalo with a bachelor's in English and continued his education at the University of Maryland and its journalism master's program. So what can we say about our speaker? He's an investigator, he's a researcher, he's a writer, he's an editor, he's a producer, he's a tactician, he's a strategist, and he's a creator. In the parlance of PR and academia, he has converged, synthesized, synergized, and integrated. He cares about building long-term relationships with clients and for clients and their audiences. In essence, he leads a team of talented people who study the past and the present to create the future. It's a pleasure to welcome our speaker, Mark Hass.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks so much. That was very flattering, and I didn't realize so many things you said about me, but I really do appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me, Fran, and giving me a chance to come and talk to students and faculty and friends at my favorite journalism school in America. I say that because not only because Chris Callahan's a good guy, and I know him and like him, but also because the work you're doing here really is leading edge. You know, a lot of journalism programs, were the caboose on a very slow train of the sort of journalism industry, and they were following an industry that really wasn't innovating for a lot of years when I was a journalist. And this program is different. This program has been committed to innovation. This program has been committed to leading the industry in new directions, and I think you're probably in really good hands as you go out into a very uncertain future in the communications business coming out of this place. I also want to thank all of you for giving up at least an hour of your St. Patrick's Day celebration tonight for this conversation. I hope it encourages you to go out and make the best of what's left of the evening. So I'm here today to talk to you about two of my favorite topics, what I call the digital context and storytelling. I want to begin that story back in 1979, when 3 Mile Island was the biggest story of the year. It's the first big radiation leak in the United States and probably in the world. It sort of changed the way we viewed risk. Jimmy Carter was president, not America's greatest president. It was a sort of a time of lackluster leadership in America. Billy Joel's song that you hear playing in the background was #1. It's a great song, and I love this picture of Billy Joel because he doesn't look like this anymore. Doesn't look like this anymore. I was a young journalist, brand new journalist, 1979, my first job working in Syracuse, New York, where I began a lot of my mornings like this with a shovel digging out. A very important journalistic tool in Syracuse if you wanted to get to work or you wanted to get your story. You needed a snow shovel there. I was covering courts and cops and just about anything else they were throwing at me, and writing stories on an IBM Selectric typewriter that was about this color. I don't know how we found one that was exactly this puke color green that I used. But these typewriters were special because they had a ball on them that typed in a way that made it easier for optical character recognition machines to read your story and then convert that eventually into upside down, inside out, and backwards type that was used to print newspapers, which was how everyone got their information. In Syracuse, New York, 80% of the news cycle was driven by newspapers. So what you put in the newspaper was really, really important. Now, I can safely say that I'm not being nostalgic when I say that all of the tools and technologies I just talked about from 1979 are gone, and the only thing you really need that I used when I was a journalist in 1979, if you happen to become a journalist or a communicator in Syracuse, is a shovel. Bring your shovel, because you're still going to need that. Technology has not sort of changed the need for a shovel. But I want you to understand that the technology revolution that killed the typewriter, that killed hot type, that is on the way to putting newspapers into the Smithsonian, that technology revolution was kindergarten compared to the one that's going on now, and the one you're living through, and the one your careers will have to bridge. The rate of change is dramatic, and the kind of nature of change has changed. The nature of change has been so much more dramatic. Now, I want to erase your fears that this is not another presentation about how the internet killed communications. I'm not a doom and gloom sort of guy. I think that technology indeed has changed things, but not necessarily for the worse. I'd like to give you a framework over the next 30 minutes for perhaps thinking about your careers as you move forward, a framework to think about the institutions that one day you're going to lead, strategic communications, journalism organizations, a way to think about how to prepare yourself to be standing here perhaps in 30 years on Must See Monday, giving your version of kind of what it's going to take to that generation of young communicators to be successful in the next 30 years. So hopefully I'll give you some tips about that. So stay with me for the next 30 minutes. I'm going to talk about 4 topics. The first topic is I want to go quickly through some media trends that I think are important for you to understand about what will drive consumption of media in the future. Probably seen a lot of this. This is my take on it. It'll only take a minute. I want to talk about the digital context. That is not the same as a digital practice. It is not the same as a digital channel. It is a digital context, and I'll explain what that means. I want to talk to you about the beauty and lasting value of storytelling, which is a true passion of mine. And finally, I want to try out on you a theory I have about the convergence of journalism and strategic communications as a craft. That the disciplines that have traditionally been separate are now coming together, and I'm going to try to explain to you why. So first, let me talk about news consumption. This is 1 minute on the internet. I'll let you look at it for a second so you understand what changed. In 1 minute in 2013, 243,000 photos were posted on Facebook. Every minute, 350,000 tweets. Every minute, 100 hours of video on YouTube, and so on and so on and so on. And if you think that's extraordinary, look at the bottom numbers, because the increase from 2012 to 2013 in the number of tweets, 250%. The amount of video, 233%. And this rate of change is continuing. It's exponential. Next year, if I'm standing here, it'll sort of likely be 500,000 photos posted on Facebook. This is an enormous amount of data and information that we're creating. And the way we're getting news now is quite different than the way we have gotten it in the past. Mobile, this technology that we carry around in our pocket, this computer that's more powerful than the computers used to land on the moon, are making news more important to us, not less. We spend more time with news, 31%. We turn to more sources for news. We're adding to the sources that we consume once we get a mobile device, a tablet or a mobile phone. We use it, we spend a lot of time consuming news. The average person looks at their mobile device 150 times a day. And a lot of that time, we're looking at news. The average person from your generation shifts their attention 17 times an hour across multiple devices. Computer, phone, tablet, computer, phone, tablet, and maybe you're reading a newspaper too. That's an enormous amount of consumption. And I have to tell you that social platforms have become news media. They are no longer just social platforms. This is from a Pew study. 62% of the people in the study say they get news from Reddit, for example, 52% from Twitter, on and on and on. These are not just social platforms. These are news platforms. People use them to get information. And while that might be scary, the reason I'm not scared and the reason I'm optimistic is because if you ask people, well, do you consume any other forms of media? The answer is yes. About a quarter say who use social media primarily for news also read newspapers. A quarter also watch cable TV news. About a quarter listen to the news on the radio. And nearly 50% watch local news. I don't really know why that is. I was trying to understand the reason that so many more people will watch local news as opposed to read a newspaper. It might be because that's where you get the weather. That's where you get sports. I don't know. Interested to hear your theory on it. So I have to say, I have to sort of quote Mark Twain or paraphrase him when I say that the reports of the death of media have been greatly exaggerated. I think that media are thriving in America, media will continue to thrive in America, and our roles as journalists and communicators will continue to be a valuable one in society. Different, but very, very valuable. Now, something is broken. The media are not broken, but the business model that made it possible to pay for news is broken. News has always been subsidized. There's never been such thing as free news. Advertising was a form of subsidy. And the destructive culprit was not, as most people think, the internet. It was not technology per se, but rather it's what I call the digital context. In order to explain that to you, I want to sort of go back to the early days of the internet. It's worthwhile to kind of always remember where it came from. The internet was a project of the Defense Department during the Cold War. It was an attempt to ensure that in the case of a nuclear attack, we could maintain defense communications. So scientists came up with this, DARPA scientists came up with this concept of building networks so that if this part of the network was blown up, the network would find another way to get the message through. This concept of networks. And then the scientists, mostly academic scientists, got the bright idea to attach these networks to high bandwidth transmission lines. And the internet was born. But more importantly, the digital context was launched. And this was not a communications phenomena, it was a human phenomena. It changed the way we were going to live for the next 50 years. And we are in the middle of the transformation that's been brought on by the digital context. I like to describe 5 transformational waves. This is an original, social scientists talk about this. I've sort of compiled it, this sort of more information. I'm not a brilliant futurist, as this might suggest. I'm just a very good researcher and a good aggregator of information, like all of you are, I suspect. So the digital context has 5 transformational waves. And I would argue that we are all, the institutions we belong to and the lives we're living, we are all small boats riding on a stormy sea of these waves, trying to hold on to the future. The first wave, and this goes back into the late 80s and the early 90s, is the creation and organization of massive amounts of information. In the early days of the internet, there were databases that were created that you needed arcane knowledge about computers to access. You needed to use something called the Usenet to get information. I don't suspect anyone in this room knows what that is. It required some fairly, sophisticated programming knowledge to access these vast amounts of information that academic institutions were connecting so they could do more research. The internet in the early days was an academic research tool. And then the browser was born, Mosaic, Netscape, and that changed everything because we now had a simple, easy user interface in which to access information. So you had this massive amount of information that you can now get to without having programming knowledge. You clicked on it, right? You had a mouse. The mouse was born, the browser was born. Suddenly this information could be organized and accessed, and that changed everything. And then Google came along, which was sort of completed the cycle in the first wave, because now you could find things. You could actually find things. And if you think about kind of how Google has sort of changed the way we live and access information, it's profound. Google's a verb, right? I mean, it not only is the place we go to when we want to know anything, it also created great, great fortunes. So one characteristic of each one of these waves is it changes our lives and it makes some people very, very wealthy when they figure out a way to organize whatever's going on. Wave 1 is done. Wave 2 is the creation and organization of large, geographically and independent human social communities. You always, back before Facebook, back before Twitter, you could access people with like-minded interests. You could go on message boards and have a chat about knitting, if that was your thing, or sports, if that was your thing. But it was difficult. It was clunky. It was awkward. It was non-visual. It wasn't interesting. It wasn't kind of a robust way to build social networks. And then Facebook came along, and Twitter came along, and suddenly you could have a social network that was completely undefined by geography. You don't need, and you know what I'm talking about. I mean, your social networks are not the people you interact with every day only. They are people, friends from high school. They are people you met one summer somewhere. They are family. They are distributed all over the place. And you can now access those social networks because they were organized through a technology called Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, Facebook and Twitter created great wealth for a lot of people. Once again, once someone figures out how to organize things in one of these waves, they make a lot of money. So keep that in mind for those of you who are entrepreneurial. Because we're in the middle of the third wave. And the third wave is about the creation and organization of massive amounts of data that's generated both by what you do and what machines do. You've heard of the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is there are very, very inexpensive sensors attached to machines all over the world doing various tasks. There are sensors attached to robots and computers, so they know when the screws are running out in the parts bin, and they're automatically transmit information to the supplier so they can bring more nuts so they don't run out. And a very simple kind of example. But there are more than 50 billion sensors attached to machines around the world. In 2 years, there will be 500 billion sensors attached to machines around the world. The Internet of Things. And then there's the Internet of Humans. We're out there doing all kinds of things on the internet. We're clicking on links. We are clicking on ads. We're having cookies dropped on us. And a vast amount of data is being generated about our behavior, as well as the behavior of these machines. Now, we're in the middle of this phase, so no one's figured out how to organize it yet. But once someone does, once we figure out how to, and there's a lot of interesting technology companies that are sprouting up in New York, of all places, as well as Silicon Valley, to figure out how to take this information and turn it into actionable and useful information. Once that happens, once again, we will go through a profound change in the way we live. I mean, there's a lot of speculation about how that affects our privacy and other kinds of things, but I predict that we will overlook the privacy concerns and be delighted when we walk past a store for our phone to beep and say, if you come in now and buy a coffee, we'll give you $1 off, for example. Fourth wave, now we're getting into a little bit more science fiction. The fourth wave is about virtual experiences. There's a lot of work already being done in virtual experiences. Someone here is wearing a Google Glass, which is the wearable technology is an example of virtual expression. The gaming industry is moving very aggressively into creating virtual environments. If you're a gamer, you know what I'm talking about. The medical industry is using virtual technologies for diagnosis, remote interactions with patients. And if any of you have seen the movie Gravity, which I thought was fantastic, if you haven't seen it, you should see it, it uses a technology that was developed at Iowa State University, a virtual immersion technology to sort of create the feeling that you are part of a virtual experience. So all those scenes of Sandra Bullock floating around in space, obviously she wasn't floating around in space, but she was floating around in an environment that was created digitally. A lot of potential here for changing the way we live, if you think about it. You think about you play this out. All the things we now do on the internet in kind of a two-dimensional way will now be able to be done in an immersive way. Changes the nature of communications in a pretty profound way. Wouldn't it be great if you could kind of put, and you're a journalist, to put your reader or your viewer into the environment you're writing about or telling about? Wouldn't it be great if you're a strategic communications professional to kind of take your target audience and have them experience kind of what you've previously told them? This is all realistic, and this is what you will experience in your lifetime. And I suspect I will as well. And finally, the fifth wave. This is what Ray Kurzweil, who's the chief engineer at Google, calls the singularity. You may have read about this. This is a moment in time when machines that are enabled by these very inexpensive sensors, connected to very high bandwidth networks, when all of that lights up into something resembling intelligence. And when that intelligence gets connected to human intelligence, and those two things together change the nature of human beings. If you look at human history, human beings tend to plateau. We're only so smart, we get this far and then something happens, as a war or something, it screws us up, we go back down here. The notion is, scientists will speculate that once the singularity happens, it lifts us to a new level so we can overcome our own limitations. Now, I'm just telling you what I read. This is I have no particular insight into this because, while I'm energized and excited to think about the future, the way the digital context maps it, I struggle as a professional to figure out how to, sorry about that. I don't want to do that. That's a video about machines. So I'm energized to kind of think about this, but I'm not a scientist, so I sort of have to come to terms with how, as a communications professional, I deal with this. What's it got to do with me? What's it got to do with you? Should be a question that you're asking. What do you make of it all? So, my answer, and this is my default position, is to tell stories. I think that rather than replacing the human need for great stories, the advance in digital technology has raised our expectation about great stories and the need for great stories. I would argue that, if you think about history, you think about science, there's a lot of evidence that your brain on digital needs stories more than ever. I'll sort of try to demonstrate why that's true. And this is important for you because you are going to be experts in stories. When you walk out of this place, the one thing you should have always in your tool belt is your storytelling capability. You will be experts. You will know the essence of stories. You will know how to create content. You will know what a compelling story is. You might use different technologies than I used in 1979 or that others have used in the past, but you will, at the heart of what you do, you will be storytellers, because while the tools have changed, the essence of stories have not. If you think back on human history, we've been defined by stories from the cave drawings of Lascaux, France, to the Bible, to Homer, to Shakespeare, to Walt Disney, to Bruce, all are great storytellers. And stories have defined how they are in different contexts. Not all these are journalists, none of them are. None of these are strategic communicators, but they were just all really great storytellers, including Kevin Smith, if you're wondering who that is in the bottom right, who was the producer of Chasing Amy and Clerks, two great movies. And we know that stories are compelling to us because it's good for our brains. There's science that supports the idea that, the digital devices mess you up. If you're looking at, if you're changing devices 17 times and you're looking at your mobile device 150 times a day, that's bad for your brain. Your brain doesn't like that. We weren't wired for that kind of experience. We were wired for consistent narrative experiences. So what do we need to do as communicators to kind of balance that out? I would argue we need to tell stories. Otherwise, our brains may blow up. Who knows? So I'll give you some examples. I mean, there's a lot of science and really interesting science about how stories make your brain better and more robust and kind of add the blood flow into your brain. If I say the words to you, perfume, lavender, soap, coffee, and if you were all hooked up to brain scans, what we would see is that your olfactory area in your brain would be lighting up with activity. It's as if you're smelling the perfume, lavender, soap, or coffee. If you watch the Olympics or you watch sports and you were hooked up to a brain scan, your motor cortex would be engaged, even though you're laying on the couch eating chips. It doesn't matter. It's as your brain is acting as if it's moving, as if your body is moving. And that is because your brain is wired to respond to words, to respond to pictures, to respond to stories. So that's why the need for great storytelling in human life isn't going to go away anytime soon. I mean, it's going to be altered. It's been altered by the digital context. It'll be altered by the oncoming transformational waves. But the need for great stories is more important than ever. The only implication I would argue for me and for you is that we really have to become better storytellers because it's harder to tell stories now than it used to be. And now, when I think about stories, I kind of need to build models to think about. I need to have kind of atomic models, if you will, that allow me to kind of understand how you tell stories. Because it's not as easy as it used to be, where you just you stood up and you told a great tale, or you painted a picture of a wild animal on a cave wall. It's not quite that simple anymore. So we need models for great storytelling. So I have 3 models that I want to share with you that I think are relevant not only to strategic communications professionals, but also are especially relevant to journalists. Because there is a convergence, I would argue, as I told you earlier, between what we do as journalists and what we do as strategic communicators. The differences are less and less all the time, fewer and fewer, I should say. So first, let me tell you about this model. What's at the nuclear level of a great story? I would argue it's 3 things. First, it's analytics. You say, what do you mean by that? Every great story is based on insight. Every great story is based on an understanding that you get about something. And the best way to get an understanding in modern life is with data. Research is a very, very important storytelling tool. And if you ever kind of have an opportunity to gather data and use that data to develop a compelling insight, your stories will always be better. Strategy is an important part of stories. A great story needs to have a context in which to live. I may tell you a wonderful story today that you just don't care about, but if I tell you that story tomorrow because of other news events, you'll be quite interested in it. So when I say you need a strategy for great storytelling, that's what I mean. The New York Times every day when they publish that thing, there's a strategy behind what they're putting in that newspaper. Every story is there for a reason. It's newsworthy, it reflects some long-term planning, it's a great read. There's a strategy into way these stories are assembled for your reading pleasure. And the third is creativity. So if you've got some analytics and you have some insights, you got a great strategy, you need an idea. You need something that's really cool that makes people want to consume it. Otherwise, no one's going to read your story. No one's going to watch it if it's boring, right? So creativity, strategy, and analytics, I would argue, are at the center of great storytelling. So that's model 1. Model 2 is something we use at Edelman that we call the media cloverleaf. And some of you may have seen this, I don't know. But when we think about content now, we think about it in 4 distinct categories. Stories live in 4 distinct categories. They live in traditional media. Everyone knows what that is. It's the New York Times, it's NBC News, it's Fortune Magazine, it's the Arizona Republic, et cetera. Hybrid media, Huffington Post, Business Insider, sort of a combination of news and interaction. It's social, as I mentioned earlier, powerful news platform, and it's owned. An owned platform is something that is yours. If you're an individual, you have your own Facebook page. It's an owned media platform. You can do whatever you want on there. You can tell whatever stories you want, create things. If you are a company, your website, for example, is an owned platform. And at the center of the cloverleaf, all of those leaves touch, and there's search, that hourglass, that magnifying glass there indicates search. Search is very, very important as a storytelling technique for the reasons I described earlier. You want to know something, you go to Google. You search for it, right? Content, that play button. You know, there's no story if you don't have great content. And the third is reverberation. And in a social era, it's all about sharing and liking. That's what I mean by reverberation. I could put something out there, and if no one sees it, who cares? But if it's shared, if it's liked, it reverberates, it echoes. These are the 3 important characteristics of what good storytelling needs to accomplish. And you know, you may be asking yourself, okay, I understand how this might work in a strategic communications environment. You've got a client, you've got to apply kind of content across all those leaves, but it applies to journalism as well. And I'll give you 3, I believe, good examples of how that's the case. Number 1, the Wall Street Journal has a great print edition. But for those of you who access the Wall Street Journal online and read the journal, you recognize that what they do online is completely different. They have created a separate hybrid media by including blogs and video and graphics and other kinds of wonderful, rich information. So that's where the traditional touches the hybrid. If you think about, I'll give you an example from the New York Times. I mentioned the New York Times a lot just because I live in New York, you know, so I can't help myself. The majority of the readers at the New York Times access content on NewYorkTimes.com via embedded links. No one types in NYT.com and goes to that page that the editors of the New York Times have assembled with all of the important stories they want you to read. You are looking at your social feeds, or you are looking at an email, or however you're accessing communications with your network, and you see a link from someone you trust and you're interested, and you click it. And that link takes you into the belly of the NewYorkTimes.com. You're somewhere in there looking at the content. Now, if you're the New York Times, traditional and social have touched. The challenge for the New York Times is how to turn that into a business. You know, their business used to be that we know most people are going to read page 3, so we're going to charge more for that ad on page 3. And if we sell the back page, we can put color on it. It's fantastic because everyone sees the back page. Nobody is going to predictable places anymore. So the New York Times is desperately trying to figure out how to monetize the point of contact between traditional and social media. How do they turn that into a business? Now, they have some interesting ideas, which I won't kind of lay out in public, but you know, they're making great progress in it. But they are using this cloverleaf. They are affected by this cloverleaf. Third and last example, Reuters, great news organization. They, as a business strategy, are allowing their journalists to be hired, specialist journalists, to be hired by companies to write white label content for websites and for other owned sites. So if you're reading content about wind power on General Electric's website, there's a good chance it was written by a Reuters reporter, and Reuters was compensated by GE, I'm just using as an example, for that reporter to write it. So now, traditional is touching owned. So this model is a very robust model, I think, for thinking about the communications business and the way it's changing. Last model. I don't want to kind of overwhelm you with these models. But once you start thinking about stories in an age of technology, you have to start thinking about process. You know, when I think about stories, I say it's a great story. I know it. My gut tells me this is a great story, and I know what to do with it as a journalist or a communications professional. But if you talk to an engineer and you say, I need to understand what a great story is, they're going to put together a process. And this is the most simplified version of a process we use at Edelman in our creative newsrooms. There's a 14-bubble version of this, which I won't, the day is not long enough for me to take you through all of it. But it's important to kind of understand how storytelling is a process. Starts with planning and informing. You need insights, you need a strategy. You have to create and produce. You need to actually write the story. You need to actually produce the video, whatever the case may be. You need to manage it and distribute it. It's not easy to do. Imagine if you're producing 100 pieces of content and you're distributing 100 pieces of content in a digital context. When do you distribute them? Where do you distribute them? You need to have a way of figuring all that out. And this part, optimization and analysis, is a relatively new school. This is sort of the third wave kind of at work. When I put a tweet out, I want to know how to make sure as many people see it as possible. It can be dumb luck, but clearly that's not a robust business strategy. You just depend on dumb luck to kind of make sure your content is seen. So there are algorithms that are trained to analyze the fire hose that is Twitter, the fire hose that is Facebook, and make intelligent decisions about what headline is most compelling, what time of day is best, which influencer is most likely to be shared by others. And so when I talk about optimizing and analyzing, that's an important part of the storytelling process. And finally, measurement, right? You need to kind of know if anyone looked at this thing and you do it again. Now, in the communications business, in the PR business, sort of we kind of always have thought like this. But I'm telling you, news organizations are thinking like this every day. They're trying to, the New York Times is saying to itself, we have a great story, we know a lot of people are reading it, what do we do now? Do we put a paid ad against it? Do we sort of have a sponsored ad on Facebook saying, read this story in the New York Times? That's coming to your Facebook page someday soon, that kind of strategy. And this sort of raises another point that I was talking with Fran about today, and I was talking with Retha, got that right? Butcher her name, about and the importance and convergence of different storytelling languages. The language of storytelling, English, Mandarin, French, German, video, photography, those were the languages of storytelling over time. Now I would argue that there are additional languages of storytelling, Perl, C++, HTML, XML, and that those are as important as the other languages because all of these bubbles here are informed by what engineers are doing now with technology. And you know what I'm talking about. You've all been exposed to it. So coming back to my thesis that this is all affecting all of us and that we are now, whether we are journalists or strategic communicators, just streams flowing into the same storytelling river. I have to kind of think that we have more in common as professionals than perhaps we did a decade ago. When the New York Times describes itself this way, again, I apologize for the New York Times obsession, but I just bump into it all the time. This is actual content from the New York Times website, from materials they use to talk about their business model. They are in the business of creating alliances. I didn't know that. They're in the business of conference sponsorship, licensing and product development, and innovative advertising. Innovative advertising means sponsored content. It means if you pay them, they'll write stuff and they'll put it on NewYorkTimes.com and vaguely cloak it as non-editorial content. All the news that's fit to print, they still do that, and they sell advertising. That's part of their business model, but this is a declining part of their business model. Every year they sell less and less advertising, fewer people read it. They're getting more and more of their money from those top four areas. And I would argue that's my business. As a PR, as CEO of Edelman, that's my business. That's what we do. So they're getting into my business. So the natural response for me is to get into their business. We at Edelman are, I think, sort of indicative of what's happening elsewhere in the industry, but I sort of believe I modestly believe we are leaders in injecting storytelling into the fabric of our organization. So we have created a new organizational concept that we call creative newsrooms. We have 8 of them operating around the world. London, Toronto, Sydney, the rest are in the United States. And these are business units that are set up to look and feel like a traditional newsroom. They're organizations that are built to create content for our clients in real time and both in a planned environment, the same way that news organizations do. News organizations respond to news, and they also have features that they're working on long term. They have enterprise, they have investigations. All of those things come together in a newsroom environment to create the evening news, to create a newspaper, to create the Wall Street Journal online. That is the model we are using on behalf of our clients to create content. It's been quite successful also, by the way. It's been very, very exciting. And this is an important part of our future business strategy. I believe that if we can successfully execute this conversion, where 30% of our business and our professionals are storytellers as opposed to strategic communicators, and there's a difference. You know, my business is built, we make money by selling services. We sell people's time, we sell things we do for clients. We don't really sell content. This is going to change that for us, and I think it'll be a profound change. So while the New York Times rushes to try to make money the way we make money, we're rushing to make money the way the New York Times makes money. It's interesting. I think it's very interesting. As a former journalist, it's sort of very interesting to me to see this convergence, and maybe I'm seeing what I want to see, but I don't think so because clients are responding to it, and our business is really doing quite well. So if you remember that picture I showed earlier of the folks reading a newspaper back in 1979 when that's how people got news, this is more representative of how we get news now. So this is sort of the new world. This is sort of the capstone of this presentation. And it suggests to me a couple of things that we as communications professionals need to think about in terms of transformation. We need to move from thinking that the goal is to be a respected specialist, the best writer in this particular area, someone who really knows crisis communications, from a respected specialist to a brilliant generalist. I think being a generalist is no longer a dirty word, is no longer undesirable, it's no longer associated with being a journeyman, which is sort of faint praise. If you can be brilliant as a generalist, you'll always have valuable skills that'll help guide your careers and help change the institutions you're running. Whereas once we relied on words and pictures primarily to tell stories, we now rely on multimedia. When I say multimedia, I'm not just talking about video, I'm not just talking about animation, I'm talking about comedy, I'm talking about drama, I'm talking about apps for your mobile phone. Those are all techniques that we need to use to tell stories. So from words and pictures to multimedia. We need to move from this idea that there's a news cycle to the idea that we need to always be ready. You know, there is no news cycle anymore. It used to be a very reliable thing for people in our business. You know, if you could get a story in the morning newspaper, it just cascaded through the day, and you could then get the TV, and then the next day there'd be second day stories, and then the Sunday newspaper would do something. It was a very reliable kind of process, and it made it easy to be both a journalist and to be a PR person, because you kind of, you knew how to do it. If you could get that story in the New York Times or the Arizona Republic and get it on page 1 above the fold, it was going to be a good day for you, regardless of whether you wrote it or you pitched it on behalf of your client. That's not the case anymore. I mean, now both journalists and communications professionals need to always be ready, because the cycle, while not always on, I disagree with people who say that we're always on, it's 24/7 news cycle. It's really not, because I'm not up 24/7. You know that most organizations do kind of shut the lights off at some point, even the very best of them. But you need to be prepared to be always on, so that if something is happening, you share it right away. You can't wait for that 2 a.m. close on the first edition, on the Bulldog edition, and that's going to go to the early risers and the people coming home from the bars. You need to always be ready. And finally, in terms of sort of career, I would argue that I'm sure that in your life you've sort of thought about your career path. Maybe you haven't, I don't know. But certainly most people think about where their career would go. You kind of go through a logical process, up, and then you end up someplace. I like to quote a concept that was coined by our US HR director, who happens to be sitting in the back, that your career in this era is more like a jungle gym than a ladder, that you're moving different places and reinventing what you do. So the idea of moving from a career path as an individual, forget about it. Think about how to innovate your career. Think about inventing your career, and not just once, but again and again and again. It sounds like a daunting thing, right? But that's the way I think about myself. I think about my own career, and Fran was kind enough to kind of, in summary, kind of suggest that, in fact, I have done that. I didn't know I was doing it at the time. It just sort of worked out that way. But I have the wisdom now of thinking that, okay, career innovation is a really important thing to do. But as you innovate, as you invent your career, remember, there's one thing you remember. Remember the importance and power of storytelling. And I'm going to end with this sort of technical kind of conversation about models and gloom and doom, changing scenario, you can't have a career path anymore. I'm going to end that with a story. Started with a story. I'm going to try to end with a story to convey the power of great storytelling. Abraham Lincoln, not a storyteller, politician, but I would argue a great storyteller. Not a journalist, I meant, not a communicator, but a great storyteller. A lot of great politicians are. And this particular clip from the movie Lincoln, Benefits of DreamWorks, Steven Spielberg and Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Daniel Day-Lewis, great storytellers, all of them. The scene here is it's late in the Civil War. Things aren't going so great. Battles aren't being won. Information isn't coming across. Lincoln is struggling to keep his cabinet together. His cabinet is fracturing. They're angry at him. They're angry at one another. And that's a reflection of the way the nation felt. And what was at stake here was not just the fate of the nation, the fate of the Union, but it was also the fate of Lincoln's agenda, which was to abolish slavery. All of this was hanging in the balance. Everything was going to hell. So what does Lincoln do? Watch it.
They've taken 17,000 shells since yesterday. I want to hear Fort Fisher is ours and Wilmington has fallen. Send another damn cable. The problem's their commander, Whiting. He engineered the fortress himself. The damn thing's his child. He'll defend it till his every last man is gone. He is not...
Coming out, you old rat! That's what Ethan Allen called out to the commander of Fort Ticonderoga in 1776. Come on out, you old rat! Of course, there are only 40-odd redcoats at Ticonderoga, but there is one Ethan Allen story that I'm very partial to.
No, you're going to tell a story. I don't believe that I can bear to listen to another one of your stories right now. I need the B&O side yard schedule for Alexandria. I asked for them this morning. I don't care.
It was right after the revolution, right after peace had been concluded. And Ethan Allen went to London to help our new country conduct his business with the king. The English sneered at how rough we are and rude and simple-minded and on like that everywhere he went. Until one day he was invited to the townhouse of a great English lord. Dinner was served, beverages imbibed. Time passed, as happens, and Mr. Allen found he needed the privy. He was grateful to be directed thence. Relieved, you might say. Now, Mr. Allen discovered on entering the water closet that the only decoration therein was a portrait of George Washington. Ethan Allen done what he came to do and returned to the drawing room. His host and the others were disappointed when he didn't mention Washington's portrait, and finally his lordship couldn't resist and asked Mr. Allen had he noticed it, the picture of Washington. He had. Well, what did he think of its placement? Did it seem appropriately located to Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen said it did. His host was astounded. Appropriate? George Washington's likeness in a water closet? Yes, said Mr. Allen, where it'll do good service. The whole world knows nothing to make an Englishman shit quicker than the sight of George Washington. I love that story.
And I love it too, and thank you for your attention. You've been a great audience. I really appreciate it. I think we have time for questions, right, if there are any. Let's grab someone with a microphone.
Okay, I guess my question then would be, you're talking about reinventing your career, and a lot of students here are graduating. How do you reinvent when you're starting? Because I've talked to some students who they're having trouble getting their first jobs because a lot of people want, years of experience, 2-3 years of experience before signing on with them. And so how do you get that experience if you're just starting out? And then how do you reinvent, like I said, when you're starting?
Oh, you're on the faculty here?
No, I'm a student.
Right. You're good. That's great. That's good to hear. That's always been true, right? I mean, I could tell you this, personal stories about how I got my first newspaper job in Syracuse, New York. I mean, what a great piece of advice that Gene Roberts. I wanted to work at the Philadelphia Inquirer when I was in graduate school at the University of Maryland. It was the greatest journalistic institution in America. They were winning multiple Pulitzer Prizes every year, and boy, I would have given anything to work there. So I finally got a meeting with Gene Roberts, who was the executive editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he was really gracious to kind of meet with me. I didn't have a clue. And he gave me a great piece of advice. He said, "You want to get a job?" Because I asked him, I said, "How'd you get your first job?" And he said, "I loaded up my car with my resume and some clips, and I started driving around in the South," because he went to school in North Carolina, something like that. And I stopped at every town, went to the newspaper, and kind of gave him my resume and clips. And then I got one. I did the same thing, but I went north. I don't know why I went north. I'm thinking this again, I wouldn't have needed that shovel if I'd kind of gone south. But that's, what you do, right? You get that first job, and it was, $180 a week, and, it was what it was, and it starts something. And I think that now there are more opportunities than there ever were for people with journalism and communication skills. If you have storytelling skills, there's a lot of ways to use them. And my industry's one, the media going through this dramatic transformation. The Googles of the world are hiring people with these kinds of skills. I mean, don't think kind of in a narrow way about what a job looks like. Think about the skills you have and think about how you might use them. Be an entrepreneur, There's a lot of ways to start. I mean, there's a kind of contemporary version, I think, of driving around with your clips and your resume and stopping at every newspaper along the way. There's a digital version of that doesn't require you to get in your car. You know what I mean? I don't know if that answers that question.
Okay, so you talked a lot about multimedia and kind of the role that the visual storytelling plays in communications. I have a bachelor's in journalism, and I'm now seeking a master's in graphic design. So I'm curious to know, do you see a role, or do you see a even stronger convergence of traditional storytelling and graphics in communications, whether that's PR or traditional journalism?
I think it's a very, very powerful combination. When I was talking about these creative newsrooms that we're setting up around the world, the idea in staffing them is to have a core group of storytellers who have skills like yours. So when you graduate, give me a call or something. A core set of people who are storytellers, who understand how to use different languages, including visual languages, to tell stories, and that there would be account people who would interact with these storytellers to help, to help them tell great stories. So I think that those combination of skills, the more skilled you are in the various storytelling techniques, the more valuable you become. Because stories, as I sort of pointed out, are sort of more complex than they used to be. And so you need more than just great words. Although I'm a writer, that's what I do. And I hate to say it, but that's really not enough anymore. Words just they aren't enough. So you're doing exactly the right thing, I think.
Other than maybe the New York Times, because you kept referencing that, would you say there's been a singular platform or news source that has been very influential in your life in terms of learning how to craft really effective stories?
I used to read, when I was at Maryland, I used to read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, not for content, but for story structure. I used to try to understand how the writer put the story together. The third graph is always the so what graph, and where's the data that supports it? How far up do you put the quote? And I was sort of, it became a textbook, right? You read great writers and you learn how to write. So those three publications were very, very influential, and I still use it for that. I still find myself doing that. It's sick. I'll be reading a newspaper on an airplane, and I'm sort of not really paying attention to the content, but I'm saying, well, why did he put that quote, writer put that quote there? And I would have put it a little higher. And I sort of find myself, re-editing. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. Yeah. From the back.
In one of the earlier slides, you had the growth of all the social networks. You had Facebook and Twitter and all that. And I noticed on the YouTube one, it was just videos. Was that videos uploaded, or was it just watched?
Videos uploaded.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, but I was interested. Yeah, okay.
Because that makes it a lot more compelling.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
There's a lot of content being created on YouTube. I mean, YouTube is an underappreciated social network. I don't understand why people don't talk about it more. There's a lot of dialogue about Twitter, a lot of dialogue about Facebook. YouTube, because of the type of content that they're aggregating, I think is ultimately a much more powerful and resilient social platform. My take.
You said that more newspapers are moving online, and that's where the majority of their income is coming from, but it's been shown recently that there's not as much money on online platforms as there was in newspapers, but information is still being processed, is still getting out there in some way, and there's more than ever. But do you see that ship being able to stay afloat for a very long time? Do you think there's ever going to be a point in time where they're on the brink of financial collapse?
I mean, I think the sale of the Washington Post was a shocking moment. Jeff Bezos bought it, and it sort of kept it alive. But he bought it for a very, very small amount of money. The $300 million, or what he paid for it, is it's less than that, whatever it was. It was a remarkably small sum, and that reflects the kind of perception of what the future value of a journalistic institution like the Washington Post is. I mean, it's really troubling in that way. Now, there's reason for optimism, because I think that most of the big media companies are looking for ways to monetize the clicks. Instead of kind of selling advertising on the right rail or advertising at the top, they're looking for ways to monetize your behavior in their space. I was talking about kind of the analytics platforms, the optimization platforms. So the New York Times, again, I'm using this as an example. Or let's use the Wall Street Journal just to change, or the FT. When you go to those, when you're accessing content on those platforms, they are collecting data about you. Not personally you, but they know kind of where you're coming from, where you were before, what else you've read when you're there, what you read next, et cetera. So they kind of get a sense of what you're interested in, what you're about. That information becomes valuable in a lot of different ways. You've seen, of course, advertisements follow you around on the internet. You've sort of experienced that, right? You read a story about trends in shoes, and suddenly you're seeing nothing but shoe ads. That's a very crude version of what I'm talking about. I think that news organizations are going to figure it out. I think they're going to figure out a way to monetize those clicks in a way that won't require selling display advertising in your face on a small screen, because that advertising just doesn't work. It's not the same.
We have time for one more question.
Hello. My journey recently has been a transition from marketing, brand marketing, field marketing, to journalism and now public relations. So your transition from journalism to public relations, was that a bit of a challenge, or how did you make that transition?
It's a good question. I think it was, in retrospect, this is all in retrospect, because at the time I didn't realize what I was doing. I made the transition around digital. It wasn't a transition to public relations. I was a journalist who became really interested in the World Wide Web, as we called it then. And Fran mentioned sort of the project that I was involved in to launch DETnews.com, the DetroitNews.com. And it was fascinating for me. The scales fell from my eyes as kind of the more time you spent with it, it was just, I said, this is going to change everything. So I got the idea that I could go out and sell my services to, I first looked for a job in the newspaper business. And, if we had more time and more beer, I'd tell you some of the stories about newspapers basically telling me I was crazy when I'd go in and say, the internet was changing everything for you. The World Wide Web is changing everything for you. And they say, go, we got a guy in the back who does that. It's fine. So I couldn't find a way to satisfy my interest, my personal interest in newspapers. So I started a company where I went around to other companies and said, the internet is going to change the way large organizations communicate. And they say, yeah. And so they hired me to do what I don't know. But that eventually became a public relations firm. That eventually was a digital firm that, because of my background in newspapers, allowed me to move into what are traditional corporate communication services. And it became a PR firm. So I was an accidental PR professional. I had a digital firm that became a PR firm. It became the largest in the state of Michigan, where I was at the time. It got bought by one of the large holding companies, and suddenly I was the global CEO of MS&L. I was the global CEO of a public relations firm in New York. I was like, what's this? I'm a digital guy. So it was sort of accidental. And what I learned from that was that if you follow your interests, if you follow your heart, you follow kind of, what your gut is and your head are telling you about what's happening, it works out. It's scary sometimes, but it works out. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's really been great. I really have enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.